Thank you. For most of my adult life, I have been miserably successful, and I just haven't known it. I have experienced high levels of stress and anxiety and worried. What would happen if I lost my job? What would happen if I had health issues? And 6 years ago, I was laid off. And our son, who has been such a huge part of this journey for me, said, "You have been talking about writing a book for the longest time. What are you waiting for?" And this simple question did not have a compelling response. And so I wrote a couple of books, and this year I was not actually planning to write any more. But last December, when I went to visit my 86-year-old mother in India, I took a copy of the Time Person of the Year magazine, the one where the Silence Breakers was the Person of the Year. And I was reading things out to her, and I started reading to her about these $1,000 a night hotel suites, where the person that was occupying this suite thought that maid service meant more than just cleaning the room. And these young women felt so helpless and so powerless that in many of these situations, they didn't even complain. And so I was reading this to my mother, and my mother is innocent but not naive. And she said, "Do you think the reason for this is that all men are scoundrels?" And I took a step back and I said, "Does that include my father, your husband?" And she said, "No, not him." And I said, "What about all your sons-in-law or your grandsons?" And she said, "Oh, not them. It's everybody else." And I started thinking that this is an issue that has got to be addressed. Because I stand before you on the shoulders of decent and kind and honorable women and men, without whom I could not have got this far. So that's how Us Too was developed, and that was my point of view, my perspective. So let's talk about my background. So I'm the little baby in my father's arms. I'm also the little child sitting on my mother's lap, and I am the youngest of 4 girls. And when I was born, someone came to my father and said, "We are so sorry. We are so sorry that you had yet another girl." And this is a while ago, and my father is no more alive, but he is behind my shoulder as I speak every time. So what my father said was, "Call me in 20 years, and you tell me how your son's doing, and I will tell you how my daughter's doing." That was the advocacy. That was the blessing that I was born with. And the smaller picture is that of our son. And that picture is so specifically descriptive of the way that he has protected and nurtured my career and this amazing journey that I find myself on. And it is in honor of people like that that I would like us to move forward with what we call #UsToo. But before we do that, let's talk about something that's happening that I am experiencing, that racism and sexism is now becoming more and more socially permissible in several corners. And it's what I call the Prism Effect. So I want you to think about all those isms that have made you feel just a little bit smaller. the ageism, the racism, the sexism, the elitism. And the PR, it's just like when a light goes through a prism, a straight beam of light goes through, but it gets distorted. And that is the prism effect, the perceived reality of what that group that we talk about, that race, that gender. So today I will be focusing on gender, but these tools will work for many other aspects in addition to gender. So when we look at that, this is something that I saw in our son's office just about the time I got laid off. And I don't have the answers, but I do want to share some questions with you. And this is the first of the questions. What would you do if you weren't afraid? That's the first question. The second question is, what else might be true? When we say something is true of all people from a certain religion or a certain gender or something, can we ask ourselves this question that my mentor asked me, which is, what else might be true? And then the third question, which is very difficult for me, can you listen as if you might be wrong? Not are wrong, but can you listen as if you might be wrong? So this is a concept that I want to introduce, which is pockets of illogic. I feel this moment so strongly that I was so worried that the intensity of my emotion may make me cry. And for years, when I have been leading teams or mentoring young women, I've said, never cry in the workplace, because that would be a sign of weakness. And then I've gone home, and I've turned on the television, and I have watched Roger Federer or some other male player, I love tennis, crying, and I've had this warm feeling and said, wow, how empathetic, how vulnerable they've allowed themselves to be, and thought of this as a huge positive. So there is my first, what I call, pocket of illogic. What are some of the other pockets of illogic, things where we have double standards? So let's look at shoes. You may notice the shoes on the right. These are actually men's shoes from several centuries ago. You may be surprised that shoes with heels were designed by men for men first. Yes. And they had a purpose, and the purpose was when you were riding, it would add a heel so that the stirrup would sort of give you a little bit of an angle. But very soon, over the centuries, men realized that it wasn't that practical, that the angle of the shoe to the floor should be about 0 to 3 degrees. So my background is engineering, so I'll be using a lot of logic and examples. And so what they decided was that they were going to have flat shoes. And look at the red pair of shoes, the stilettos to the left of it. The average angle of a male shoe versus the average angle of a female shoe is about a 20 to 30 degree difference. And we know that there's going to be some impact on our back and, a lot of health issues possibly. And yet that's the pocket of illogic that we have set up, is that a female professional shoe has to have a different angle. So again, I'm just going to ask these questions. And so I realized that something was going to have to be different. I've called myself an inclusion catalyst because I have been different my whole life. A female engineer, an Asian working in North America, and so I focus so much on inclusion. And then I realized that there are two pieces to having a common ground and people coming together. And one of those pieces has to do, of course, with inclusion, with building and reinforcing inclusion. So that's an acronym for the word bridge. The B, R, and the I is building and reinforcing inclusion. But inclusion only happens when a person is in the room. And so what we really have to do before that is to destroy the guardrails of exclusion. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we look at this, there's a lot of small things that happen, subtle things that make one group feel just a little bit less than the other. This is pioneering work from the 1970s by Dr. Mary T. Rowe of MIT, where she started talking about these tiny little things that make one group less equal, which is called micro-inequities. And so the other piece of it is micro-affirmations, the small things that make someone feel included. So I'm actually going to do a little bit of a show and tell. So for a second, I'm going to step out. This is a lovely color, pink, right? This is a lovely scarf. This color has associated with it a guardrail of exclusion. There is something in the marketing world, in retail, which is called the pink tax. There is a phrase, shrink it and pink it. I've been on some radio programs, and one of my radio hosts, a female, said, I always buy male deodorant because you get more for a larger sized container. Go to a grocery store and see this is one of the barriers. This is one of the guardrails of exclusion, even though it's a lovely color. Every time we have our little girls wear pink, pretty in pink, and be kind and pleasant and obedient, we are sending a message. So where did the gender gap come from? Look at your social media feed. Look at the words that we use to describe little girls. See how we talk about them being lovely and pretty and obedient and kind. For about 2 years, I've been collecting information. I have been asking questions of what is like a girl, what is like a boy, what is like a woman, and what does like a man mean. What does like a girl, like a boy, like a woman, like a man mean? And what was most important was not the words that were said. Out of over 500 data points, kind was never a word that was used to describe a man, never. Out of 500 data sets, competitive was never a word that was used to describe a little girl. So the gender gap isn't just in money, but it's in also the way that we behave. So let's talk about, this is an original bias and stereotyping framework that I developed about 5 years ago. And I think that what's happening is that we don't go to the fifth judgment. There are 4 judgments that happen about a person, and I will give them in the context of gender, but these judgments apply across any of the isms that I mentioned. And so the first thing has to do with reputational currency or buzz, the things that we use to describe a group. And as a female engineer, I can tell you that one of the things that I miss most in this writing and speaking career of mine is math. I miss the beauty of arithmetic. From when I started with 2 + 2 = 4 and graduated to 2 + 2x is equals to 4 and went on to x² and x³. I remember when our son was in high school, I would wait for him to come home and say, do you have any calculus that I can help you with? And he would give me a bit of a look. He was very polite. He never said anything, but I could read his thought bubble. And yet, what do we say? That this is something that an entire group, 50% about of the world, just not good enough at math. And so I asked that question again, what else might be true? What is the reputational currency by gender around subjects like science, technology, engineering, arts, and math? So I won't go through all of those, but let me talk about physical impact or appearance. We have that expression, don't judge a book by its cover. If human beings are books, something that I love so much, if human beings are books, I believe more than half the time we judge women by their covers and men by their contents. So that's the 5 judgments. This is something that happened to me. I do nonprofit work. I try to go back down the pipeline and give back as my father made it easy and shattered stereotypes for me. So I work with schools, elementary and middle school and other schools and colleges to try and reduce gender bias and stereotyping. And this young woman was in one of our sessions, and let's call her Brenda. Her son, let's call him Jack, was just 2 years old. And when the two of them were flying, the flight attendant came to them and said, "Brenda, would you like to bring your son, Jack, to the cockpit? Because our captain would like to give him that little badge that you get, the little flyer badge, the little pin." And so they went to the cockpit, and the door opened, and the pilot came out, and the captain was a female. So Brenda was so pleased and excited, and she noticed that her little 2-year-old boy, Jack's eyes widened. And then the captain, the female pilot, put the badge onto the little boy and, shook his hand and went back inside. And Brenda said her little boy, Jack, cried all the way home. And she asked him, "Why? Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because that wasn't a real pilot." And she asked, and of course their names aren't really Brenda and Jack, it's by anonymity. And so Brenda said, "What do you mean?" And a 2-year-old boy said to Brenda, to his mother, "Because a pilot is a man." What are we doing as a society that a 2-year-old child knows with such utter conviction that a pilot is a man? I'm going to get another prop before I finish. Before I close, I want each and every one of you to think about one action that you might take differently because you now know about the costs of gender stereotyping and bias. And I call myself an exclusion exterminator. I'm no longer an inclusion catalyst alone. I am an exclusion exterminator. And so as I invite all of you to become exclusion exterminators with me, I'm going to read a few lines from one of my books. I see you. You are as me, caught in what Kavi called the thick of thin things. Take a deep breath, as I did a moment ago. There is no moment in time but this one, fleeting and ephemeral, powerful in its fragility. Together, shall we seize this moment and, gathering momentum, make it momentous? All movements start with a single small step. What will yours be?